Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing an audiobook that I listened to, A Short History of the World According to Sheep by Sally Coulthard. So this is the audiobook that I listened to it in, and this was actually a recommendation from a librarian at the library that I go to. I am a frequent enough visitor to the library that the librarians know me, which might be a good thing, but also might be a bad thing. I haven't decided yet. But they recommended this book to me, so I decided to give it a listen. I love the audiobook version if you're looking for it. And while I was a little skeptical, or not skeptical, I had some reservations going into this book, it wound up being a very enjoyable book, and there were some chapters that I particularly enjoyed. I say skeptical because I feel like this book fits into a genre of history, pop history books that tend to take one object and then magnify its importance. So it takes an object that is associated with human history and then tracks that object through human history. Another example of a book I've read in this genre that I've made up is The History of Salt, I think it was called, by Mark Kurlansky, where you just take an object that has a close association with humans and then you track it throughout human history. These books tend to be quite enjoyable because it takes an object and you can kind of see how it has influenced human history, but the downfall of these sort of books is it tends to, in my opinion, magnify the importance of this one particular object, where by the end of the book you get the sense that human history would have collapsed without, in this example, sheep, or without salt, which I don't know if human history, it would have been different in many regards, but I don't know if it would have collapsed or been as important as the authors make it out. So I go into these with a grain of salt, no pun intended, where I think that there may be an overemphasis of the importance, but you can still learn a lot from these types of books, and that's how I felt about a short history of the world according to sheep. So this book starts with the domestication of sheep. So the author starts by talking about what sheep were like before they were domesticated, and the domestication of sheep isn't something that's well tracked. Sheep were already kind of domesticated by the time writing and history come onto the scene, so we sort of have to extrapolate from our known knowledge and try to figure out how these sheep were domesticated, what traits would have been selected for, and how humans would have domesticated these creatures, which became closely associated with humans. And sheep have a lot of byproducts: milk, meat, but most importantly wool, and we'll get back to wool in a minute. So the beginning is about domestication and the reconstruction, and then the author takes a detour because, well, the domestication aspect and some aspects at the beginning tend to view sheep throughout all human history. The vast majority of this book, I would say, is sheep in Western European history. So just keep that in mind. So we then zoom into sheep in languages, although there is some discussion about sheep in things like Chinese astrology, or sheep in the use of the term like black sheep in different languages. There's the way that sheep and sheep related words appear in languages. Again, I feel like that starts to particularly focus on Western Europe, or Europe in general. And then we go into sheep and dogs. So the way dogs were also domesticated, and not necessarily how the dogs were domesticated, but the way that dogs were taken and their skills were taken to go with sheep and sheep herding and sheep management, and how these two species have kind of formed a little bit of a relationship with each other, with humans maybe forming some sort of relationship triangle. Sheep, dogs, humans, all kind of working together. Maybe the sheep are the less willing participants of this triangle, but the dogs play an important role in herding sheep, managing sheep, and that section for me was very, very interesting. We now return to wool because partway through the book, I think the author really switches focus. So the author narrows in on Western Europe, and then the author shifts focus from sheep to sheep's most important product, arguably wool. So wool is a very, very important economic commodity throughout a lot of human history. So the author understandably takes a long time to discuss wool. Wool is something that, when we covered the domestication, the author takes time to mention that wool is not necessarily something that they naturally produce, or they do naturally produce it, but wool production was something that was selected for when humans were breeding sheep. And for that reason, there were many traits that were selected that have resulted in wool production. So an example of this is some sheep naturally drop their wool, but then that becomes very inconvenient if you are domesticating sheep over a long period of time, because you have to go find where your sheep dropped their wool. It makes more sense if you have a sheep that retains their wool and then you have to shear it off yourself. But we're kind of turning again, because now it becomes very expensive in modern times to pay someone to shear sheep. So now we're trying to breed again to select for wool to drop off the sheep. But wool is a massive, massive product economically, and there were lots of laws, there were lots of guild, and of course wool has to be turned into things, so we need to turn that into different knitting projects and the different ways the socks were used. So wool has a massive, massive starring role in this book, which makes sense because it is such an important economic prospect. It was part of the domestication process. Traits for wool were bred into these sheep or selected for in these sheep. And the cost of wool, the money of wool, the economic position that wool and wool money gave people was very, very important. Again, at this section, we really are focusing on the role wool played in Western Europe. At this point, we've kind of have forgotten about what was happening in most of the rest of the world, which though I am okay with. When I went into this book, I saw it was a 6-hour audiobook, so I really can't expect this to be a fully comprehensive view of every place that sheep played in human history. 6-hour audiobook, quite literally labeled a short history of the world, although maybe a short history of Western Europe would have been more accurate. I wasn't too upset with the fact that we were kind of ignoring whole sections of history because I'm sure a lot had to be cut to fit into this book. But wool and wool production, the mills, the labor that went into the mills, the role it played in even things like World War I and World War II, different unique patterns, and the development of knitting overall as a whole came out of these chapters that took place in the middle of the book, which were less sheep chapters and more wool chapters. But wool comes from sheep, so it's okay that we have this connection. But at the very end of the book, the author brings it back to sheep and talks about various scientific breakthroughs or scientific discoveries like blood transfusion and other things like cloning, for example, another big one, things that took place with regard to sheep. So there have been various scientific breakthroughs, discoveries where sheep have played a little bit of a role. So that last section is just scientific advances, which again, we're kind of covering a lot in one tiny chapter. I felt like that section went by really, really quickly, or that chapter went by really, really quickly, but the author is again moving very quickly in a short history of the world. Overall, I think the book did a pretty good job. Go in with the expectation that this is not a comprehensive overview. You're not covering every way that sheep, wool, sheep byproducts are used throughout the entirety of human history. It is a short history, and keep in mind that this is going to be heavily focused on Western Europe, and in particular, England, Scotland, those regions. It's very, very heavily focused there. So knowing those limitations in mind, I do feel, again, like the author also kind of placed a lot of importance on sheep because she is writing a book on sheep and their history. However, I felt like the overall story was pretty balanced and fair. So despite my hesitation going in, I did think that overall the author did a good job approaching the subject. I'm not a very crafty person, so the entire section about knitting was just, a lot of it went over my head. I don't know how to knit. I don't know how to do any of that sort of stuff. So I just trusted that there were different patterns. There was some interesting sections about like knitting patterns into wool to transmit secret messages, which if you recall A Tale of Two Cities, that is a plot point in A Tale of Two Cities, but apparently that really happened. And so some of it was interesting. It wasn't so complex that if you don't knit, you can't understand that section. But I would say that was probably the least interesting section for me besides the secret codes being passed in knitting, just because I'm not very interested in the crafty side of life, let's say. The section I did find interesting, which was surprising to me, was the way that dogs were domesticated with sheep. And maybe I'll upset some people. Dogs are great, but I'm personally a cat person. I'm not a dog person. So I was surprised to find this dog domestication section so interesting to me. And the author talks about how dogs, when they're doing their corralling gesture or their behavior where they herd sheep all together, they're relying on having the dog's instinct to like hunt sheep, but trying to not have it do the final action, which is to attack and kill the sheep. So it's very selectively retained traits, and I feel like I could have read a whole 6-hour or listened to a whole 6-hour audiobook just on sheep and dogs and that domestication and that training process, because I feel like that was so interesting to me, and I was very surprised because that section was not the part of the book. If you showed me a list of the chapters at the beginning of this book, it would not have been the one that I would have pointed out as probably being the most interesting, but it wound up being the most interesting. And that was chapter 7 for those of you who are following along at home. But overall, it was an enjoyable, fun read. So if anything I said in this book review sounds interesting, you may want to check this book out. Again, A Short History of the World According to Sheep by Sally Coulthard. So this is interesting. This was an interesting book. And if you found anything that I said interesting, please let me know in the comment section down below. Please let me know if you've read this book as well, what you thought about it, and anything that you think I may have missed in this review. Please let me know. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.